Have you ever wondered why we are so obsessed with the image we see in the mirror or on our cell phone screens? Is our incessant quest for approval and perfection really about feeling better? Or are we just unconsciously repeating a myth that has echoed for millennia? The story of Narcissus, one of the most fascinating tales in Greek mythology, is as old as the concept of vanity itself, but it is also, surprisingly, more current than ever. This myth, often reduced to a simple lesson about the dangers of selfishness, actually carries deep layers about human nature. He invites us to reflect on how an obsession with outward appearance can lead us to a devastating disconnect with what really matters: the people around us, our values, and even ourselves. Narcissus was not just any young man. Her beauty was described as unparalleled, almost divine, something that transcended the ordinary. His presence felt magical, as if he carried some kind of irresistible aura. But there was something unsettling about his perfection. Narcissus saw no value in anyone but himself. As much as his beauty attracted people from all corners, he rejected love and affection as if they were a burden unworthy of his attention. However, this physical perfection hid something darker. Narcissus lived isolated, unable to create genuine bonds or share his life with others. He was an island of beauty and selfishness, but also of profound loneliness. And it was this disconnection that led him to the tragedy we know so well. When faced with his own image reflected in a fountain of crystal clear waters, he fell madly in love, not by someone else, but by the idealized reflection of yourself. Here comes the first disturbing question. Was Narcissus vain, or was he just running away from something? While many interpret the myth as a criticism of vanity, perhaps it is more of a metaphor for our eternal search for something unattainable. In the case of Narcissus, this search materialized in his own reflection, something perfect, untouchable, but also illusory. He spent hours, days, even his entire life, stuck at the edge of that fountain, admiring something that could never be real. In the end, he succumbed not because he loved himself too much, but because he couldn't find satisfaction in who he was, what was around him, or what he could offer to others. This brings us to the most disturbing reflection. How many of us are doing exactly the same today? Modern society is a machine for creating Narcissus. Social media is the source of crystal clear waters of our time, reflecting idealized versions of who we want to be. The likes, the followers, the positive comments, all of this is like the reflection that Narcissus saw: irresistible, seductive, and at the same time, absolutely empty. Every time we open an app to check our notifications, we are, in a way, leaning towards the same source that consumed Narcissus, seeking validation there that we often cannot find in ourselves. And the scariest question, this is not just a choice, it's almost a necessity embedded in our psyche. Since the beginning of humanity, we have been programmed to seek acceptance, to feel part of a group. But while in the past this meant surviving with the tribe, today it means being liked by complete strangers. Like Narcissus, we isolate ourselves in a world that seems full of connections, but in reality is frighteningly lonely. But what if we look closer? The myth of Narcissus is not just a story of vanity. It's also a warning about what happens when we place our identity on something superficial. Narcissus didn't know who he was other than what he saw in that reflection. Her beauty was, at the same time, her greatest gift and her greatest curse. He believed his image defined him, and in doing so, he completely lost touch with who he really was. And here another micro-conflict arises. Are we also losing ourselves in our idealized images? Today's culture, with its unrealistic standards of beauty and success, constantly reinforces this disconnect. Have you ever noticed how inadequate we feel when comparing ourselves to the images we see on social media? Even though we know they are carefully edited, we still measure ourselves against them. Just like Narcissus, we are being pulled into a vicious cycle where we desperately seek something that always seems to be out of reach. Perhaps this is what makes the story of Narcissus so powerful and so hauntingly prophetic. She shows us what happens when our existence becomes centered only on the surface. Instead of delving deeper into who we are and how we relate to the world, we become stuck in a reflection, static, perfect, but unreal. So the question is inevitable: are we doomed to repeat the tragedy of Narcissus? Or is there still time to step away from that source and reconnect with what really matters? This is the question that will lead us to the next part, where we will explore how the myth of Narcissus is directly reflected in the digital age and modern human behavior. After all, what has changed since ancient Greece? The answer may be more disturbing than you think. Imagine a moment when you are alone, walking leisurely in a calm and isolated place, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Suddenly you come across something so beautiful that it seems impossible to look away, a reflection so perfect, so fascinating, that it seems to contain everything you ever wanted to be. Now ask yourself, would this be an encounter with beauty or a confrontation with an obsession? This is exactly what Narcissus experienced that sunny afternoon, when he met for the first time his own image reflected in a source of crystal clear water. The water was still, as clear as glass, and the reflection returned a flawless version of himself. But here's the most intriguing point. Narcissus didn't know that image was of him. For him, it was something external, something new and absolutely irresistible. How many times do we catch ourselves admiring something that we project to be, but that deep down we know is just an illusion? Narcissus, a young man of incomparable beauty, was desired by all, but his inability to genuinely connect with others created a deep void. It didn't matter how many people admired him or wanted to be by his side, he remained untouchable, as if nothing was worthy of his attention. It's easy to think of him as arrogant, but deep down, Narcissus was trapped in a paradox that many of us face: the endless search for something perfect, without realizing that this search isolates us. He leaned over the fountain, mesmerized. Every curve of her face, every detail, seemed to be the work of a deity. It didn't take long for the fascination to turn into obsession. He spent hours there, unable to move away. What started as curiosity soon became necessity, and then inevitably his life began to fall apart. This story may seem distant, almost too poetic, but think about it. How many people do you know who spend hours in front of their own digital reflections? Who has never adjusted a photo, looked for the best angle, or spent minutes indecisive about which filter to use before posting something on social media? Narcissus's reflection is today our cell phone screen. If before he saw himself in crystal clear water, today we see ourselves in carefully edited selfies, in stories that disappear within 24 hours, but that carry the weight of appearing perfect. We are leaning towards our own source, trying to find validation in the reflection that fulfills us. But are we looking at reality or at an idealized version of who we want to be? Narcissus became trapped in a vicious cycle, something many of us experience daily without realizing it. With each like, comment, or new follower, we feel a small spike of satisfaction, a burst of dopamine that encourages us to repeat the process. And just like him, we forget the world around us. We stop eating, drinking, living in the moment, everything to keep our attention fixed on that reflection, on that never-ending search for validation. For Narcissus, the price was his life. He died on the edge of that fountain, consumed by an obsession that isolated him from everything and everyone. For us, the price can be different but equally devastating. Loneliness, anxiety, constant comparisons, feelings of inadequacy. It's a different kind of death, but equally painful. Let's bring this into our everyday lives. Have you ever spent a whole morning feeling great until you open social media and see someone posting something that looks much better? Maybe an incredible trip, a perfect body, a seemingly magical moment, and suddenly everything you have seems small, insufficient. This is the reflection of our modern font, an idealized version of reality carefully put together to appear perfect. And like Narcissus, we lean in closer, trying to capture a piece of that perfection without realizing it was never real. But there is something we need to understand. Narcissus was not just a victim of his vanity, but of an illusion. He believed that the reflection in the water was something he could reach, touch, and love. We do the same, believing that if we reach a certain number of followers, if we have the ideal body, or if we post the perfect photo, we will finally feel complete. But that never happens, because we are chasing a mirage. And here's the real food for thought. Are we too focused on our own sources to realize what really matters? With each passing day, social networks become more powerful in keeping us connected to this obsession. The time we spend creating an idealized version of ourselves is the time we could invest in real relationships, in authentic moments, and in discovering who we really are without filters or edits. But how to break this cycle? How to move away from the source and reconnect with what is real? This is the question we need to start asking, and which will guide us in the next steps of this journey. Before moving on to the next part, let me extend an invitation. Look at the reflection you are chasing and ask yourself if it truly represents who you are. Are you living like Narcissus, stuck in something you can never achieve, or are you willing to move away from the source to rediscover what really matters? Have you ever stopped to think about how a screen can reflect not only your face, but also your biggest desires, insecurities, and fears? Today, the myth of Narcissus no longer lives on the edge of a crystalline source, but rather in each infinite scroll, each carefully edited post, each search for validation in the virtual universe. But are we realizing the profound impact this has on our lives? Social networks were created with the promise of connecting us, but ironically, they are taking us further and further away from ourselves. The logic of these platforms is simple. The more you interact, the more you want to interact. It sounds harmless, but in practice it's as if we're constantly leaning over a modern font, hypnotized by an idealized version of what we'd like to be. Think about it. How many times have you opened a social network just to check something quick and, minutes later, realized that you were completely absorbed by it? This feeling of wasting time is no coincidence. Everything is designed to hold your attention. The colors, the notifications, the algorithms that know exactly what you want to see. But here's the question few ask. Who's really in control, you or the screen? To understand how we got here, we need to talk about dopamine, the pleasure neurotransmitter. Each like, comment, or notification triggers small doses of this chemical in your brain, creating a temporary feeling of reward. This experience activates the same reward system that kicks in when we fall in love, eat something delicious, or achieve an important goal. Sounds amazing, right? But there's a problem. This feeling is ephemeral, and you end up wanting more. This cycle creates a perfect trap. With each new post, we seek external approval like Narcissus sought his reflection in the water. The difference is that in the digital world, this reflection is not just idealized, it is manipulated. With filters, edits, and strategic angles, we create versions of ourselves that even we cannot achieve. This raises a disturbing question. If not even we can live up to our own creations, who can? And the price of this incessant search goes beyond wasted time. Studies show that intensive use of social media is directly linked to feelings of anxiety, depression, and social isolation. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? In a world where we are more connected than ever, we feel increasingly alone. This is because we are exchanging real connections for superficial interactions. Let's illustrate this with a story. Imagine a young woman who posts a photo on an ordinary day. She spends hours choosing the best filter, adjusting the lighting, cutting out imperfections. When the photo goes live, the likes start to arrive, and with them, that feeling of euphoria. But as time passes and notifications dwindle, she starts to feel strangely empty. What seemed like validation turns into a need. She needs to post again, to feel that dopamine spike again. Thus begins an endless cycle of searching for something that will never completely satisfy her. But this doesn't just happen to her. The logic of the system was designed to create daffodils en masse. Social networks like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook are true stages where everyone seeks the same thing: attention, approval, visibility. And the most curious thing, many who achieve this do not feel fulfilled. Why? Because, just like Narcissus's reflection in the water, what we receive in these environments is just a projection. It's not real, it's not lasting. Have you ever noticed how the search for digital perfection makes us more critical of ourselves? How does every rejected selfie, every negative comment, weigh more than it should? It's as if we are becoming our own judges, perpetually dissatisfied. And what's most frightening, this behavior not only affects adults, but also children and teenagers, who grow up believing that their value is directly linked to acceptance on social networks. Then the crucial question arises: do we still have time to move away from the digital source before it consumes us completely? But before we get to that answer, we need to recognize something important. The problem is not just with social media itself, but with how we use it. Like Narcissus, we forget what is around us, focusing only on the reflection. We ignore real moments, people close to us, our own emotions, all in the name of validation that, in the end, will never be enough. And now I ask you, what do you see when you look at your own digital source? Is it a real version of who you are, or just a reflection of who you would like to be? If you felt the impact of these words, it's time to reflect. Are we becoming prisoners of our own creations? And most importantly, what can we do to take back control? In the next part, we will explore ways to break this cycle and rediscover our connection with what really matters. Are you ready to take the next step? How many times have you asked yourself if the endless search for recognition and validation is really worth it? And more, are we getting closer to who we really are, or losing ourselves in idealized versions that we create for the world? These questions are at the heart of our era, but the myth of Narcissus, even though it is ancient, offers more relevant answers than we imagine. Narcissus's behavior, and that of so many of us today, is not just about vanity. It is, in fact, a silent cry for something deeper: connection, meaning, belonging. His obsession with his own image reflects what many modern psychologists describe as the emptiness of the self. It is not the image itself that we seek, but what it represents, a way to compensate for our deepest insecurities. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, saw narcissism as a normal phase of childhood, where the child believes he or she is the center of the universe. But what happens when this phase is not overcome? When does the childhood desire to be admired become a constant in adult life? Freud described this as a defense mechanism, an effort to protect the ego from a reality that seems unbearable. And here comes a disturbing question. Are we using social media in the same way that Narcissus used his font? Imagine the following scenario. A person who feels a deep emotional emptiness. Instead of confronting him, she takes refuge in external validation. A complimentary comment here, a like there, and for a moment, everything seems fine, but it's just an escape. The feeling of emptiness returns even stronger, creating an endless cycle. Modern psychology offers frightening insights into this behavior. Studies show that narcissism, especially in its digital form, is often linked to deep-seated insecurities. It's as if the person said, "If I am perfect in the eyes of others, maybe I will finally feel enough." But can this incessant search be satisfied? Here's something that might surprise you. In a survey by the American Psychological Association, 56% of young adults said they feel constant pressure to appear successful on social media. This number increases to 74% when we talk about teenagers. Digital perfection, however, is a costly illusion. Anxiety, depression, and feelings of inadequacy are just some of the most common symptoms among those who spend hours trying to achieve an unattainable ideal. And it doesn't just affect the mind, the body also pays the price. Insomnia and physical exhaustion are common in people who feel trapped in this search. Just as Narcissus stood by the fountain until he lost his life, many of us are wasting ourselves in front of our screens. But the most disturbing thing is that we don't realize what we are sacrificing. Think about it. How many real moments have you wasted trying to capture the perfect angle for a photo? How many conversations could have been deeper if your focus wasn't on posting something interesting? From a philosophical point of view, the myth of Narcissus goes beyond vanity. It is a warning about the fragility of our identity. Philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir believe that the search for external validation is actually a form of escapism. Instead of accepting the complexity of who we are, with our flaws, doubts, and fears, we prefer to hide behind masks. Sartre described this as the other's gaze. According to him, when we live worried about other people's opinions, we become prisoners of external judgment. We lose the freedom to be authentic. This idea is deeply connected to the myth of Narcissus. When he lost himself in the reflection, he saw nothing else. He didn't see who he really was, nor did he see the others around him. But is the modern world so different? Today, social media amplifies this alienation. We are not only prisoners of what others think, but also of what we believe others expect of us. It's a dangerous game, because the main rule is never to show weakness. The result? A society increasingly disconnected from its emotions, its relationships, and most importantly, itself. Pause for a moment. Think about how this information connects to your own life. Have you ever felt like you needed to be something you're not, just to please others? Have you ever sacrificed an authentic moment to create a perfect image? If the answer is yes, don't feel guilty. This is not an individual problem, but a collective one. We are all learning to deal with an era that demands constant performance. Now imagine the opposite. living without the pressure to impress, connecting with people without filters, accepting your imperfections as part of who you are. Sounds liberating, doesn't it? But if we recognize the problem, what is the solution? Psychologists like Carl Rogers and Heinz Kohut offer ways to overcome narcissism. Rogers believed in the importance of unconditional self-acceptance, a state in which we love and accept ourselves as we are, without depending on external validation. Kohut, on the other hand, saw narcissism as a disguised cry for help. He believed that people who excessively seek admiration from others actually crave a sense of connection and emotional security. This means that the key to breaking the narcissist cycle is looking within. Instead of looking for an idealized reflection, we should look for what truly makes us feel complete: genuine connections, purpose, authenticity. And if you think this is difficult, remember, every step towards your essence is a step away from the illusory reflection. We are reaching the moment when we need to choose. Will we continue to lean on the source, searching for something that will never be enough, or will we have the courage to step back and face who we really are? This decision is not easy, but it can transform the way we live. After all, what matters more, how many likes you receive, or how many people are truly by your side? We have reached the decisive moment. Throughout this journey, we explore the myth of Narcissus, its implications in the digital age, and the psychological and philosophical impact of this obsession with reflection. But now the question that really matters is, how can we escape this cycle? How can we step away from the source and rediscover what is authentic and meaningful? The answer lies in a simple but transformative movement. Stop looking outside and start looking inside. It seems obvious, but it's not easy. For so long, we have been conditioned to seek external validation, to measure our worth by the reactions of others, that the act of genuinely connecting with our essence has become a forgotten skill. But here's the good news. It's possible to reverse this process, and it all starts with small daily choices. First of all, we need to accept a fundamental truth. We are imperfect, and that's wonderful. Our flaws, doubts, and fears are not weaknesses, but what makes us human. When we stop seeking unattainable perfection, we begin to free ourselves from the weight of the idealized reflection. Think about a sincere conversation with someone close to you, where you could be vulnerable, without filters or masks. These moments not only create deep connections, but they also remind us that we are more than what we project. Accepting who we really are is the first step to overcoming modern narcissism. And if you feel like this is challenging, remember, even Narcissus had his insecurities. The myth is not about perfection, but about the tragedy of striving for something impossible. By recognizing our limitations, we free ourselves from this endless search. One of the biggest pitfalls of the digital world is that it keeps us looking outward, comparing our lives to other people's. But what if we started to redirect that focus? Instead of asking, "What do others think of me?" ask, "What do I think of myself?" Create moments of disconnection. Take time to step away from your screens and connect with the world around you. Try a day without social media and notice the difference. Use this time to do something that really feeds your soul. Read a book, take a walk outside, or even write about your emotions. Every minute you spend away from your digital source is a step towards your freedom. If there's anything the myth of Narcissus teaches us, it's the value of real connections. Narcissus died alone, trapped in his obsession. But we have the chance to choose a different path. Prioritize relationships that go beyond the surface. Try to actively listen to the people around you, share your stories, and open yourself up to vulnerabilities. Studies show that deep emotional connections not only improve our mental health, but also help us build solid, lasting self-esteem. Remember, what really fills the void we feel is not the number of followers or likes, but the quality of the relationships we build. Now let's imagine the future. What would you like to see when you look back in 10, 20, or 30 years? Will the hours spent seeking validation on social media be what you value? Or will it be the moments when you were present, authentic, connected with people and with yourself? The choice is in our hands. Just as Narcissus had the opportunity to move away from the source, we also have the chance to do things differently. We don't need to be prisoners of reflection. We can free ourselves, reset our priorities, and build a life that is more meaningful than any filter or like could represent. If this journey so far has made you reflect, it's time to act. Start small. Today, take a few minutes to disconnect, to look within, to value a conversation or a real moment. Share in the comments an action you plan to take to move away from digital source. Your story can inspire others to do the same. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. By doing so, you are not only supporting our work, but also committing to continue exploring these profound and transformative themes. Thank you for following us here. The myth of Narcissus is not just an ancient story. It is a mirror of our society, an opportunity for reflection and change, and that's just the beginning. Because at the end of the day, it's not about what others see in us, it's about how we see ourselves, and more importantly, how we live.